Dr. McKenna, what is top of mind for you today?
Sabbath, thank you for asking me that question. This is what's top of mind is that trust isn't just about relationships. It's about truth. It's about what's real between us. Me knowing you and you knowing me. And in the past, we trusted what we were told. We trusted what we read in the paper. Yes, the newspaper, what we heard on the radio, what we saw on the news. But in many ways, that's not trust. That's information. That's belief without relationship. And real trust isn't just one way. It's worked out. It's a conversation. It's tested in conflict and proven in vulnerability. And here is the problem. The information we get today isn't just one way, it's personalized. It's tailored to our preferences, shaped by our clicks. It doesn't challenge our biases. It confirms them. And that's not evil, but it's not trust either. And I want to give you two litmus tests. This is just where my brain was as I was thinking about our conversation today. Two litmus tests. If someone can't articulate the other side or even argue the other side, they're not earning trust. They're reinforcing their narrative. And the second litmus test is this, that one of the greatest litmus tests of our ability to be trusted is our interest in our own trustworthiness. It is really hard for you to trust me if I'm interested in whether or not if I'm only interested in whether or not you are trustworthy. That's a one-way ride into oblivion. We have to be interested in our own trustworthiness. And so why is this important now? Because it used to be that trust was hardest in our closest relationships, at home, at work, in the tension between us. But now it actually might be easier to build trust in a team than in the data we're fed every day. Why would that be true? Because in relationships, we get to work it out. We get to name the truth. We get to test it. We get to measure it. And we can build trust within us, between us, and around us. And that's why we're here. Because the future doesn't need more noise. It needs more trust. It needs real trust. The kind that grows when we choose to work it out together. And today, the trust script has flipped. And this is why I'm so excited for our guest today. This conversation is going to be real, working out what it really means to measure and build trust. A chance to talk about the opportunity to measure and build trust between us in a world where too often trust isn't being worked out, where we have begun to assume that the information we are fed is true. But between us, we get to work it out.
So let's get this wild conversation going. So good, Dr. McKenna. Welcome to the Wild Conversation, where human being and human doing converge, reshaping the world of leadership, culture, and performance. Today, we get to have a wild conversation with Chris Shaffer, former Director of Learning and Insights at Microsoft, and now our Strategic Development Architect at WiLD Leaders. Among the many ways Chris has transformed our team, he leverages data and insights from the WiLD Trust Index and the toolkit to create alignment between people, their teams, and their organization. Chris, we are excited for this conversation. Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, it's my pleasure to be here.
We are going to play a quick round of wild cards as we do, and you are very familiar with this game. I just picked 10 out of the 52. I have been informed that our deck actually has 52 cards of questions. So I will choose. I just pulled out 10 at random and I'll shuffle them even again so that I don't know which card is where. We'll pick a card number between 1 and 10. I'll go first. Chris, you go second. Rob will round us out. We'll go deep quick. I'm going to choose number 4. What important details on your agenda are a part of your bigger purpose? This is fun. There are many different types of things on my agenda today. Some that include book editing, some that include mission, purpose statement writing, some that include budget planning. And so all of those things are little pieces of the bigger purpose of my role on our team, my role in our family's role in this world, all the little parts that make a big difference. Chris, pick a number between 1 and 10.
Let's go number 1.
All right. Ooh, number 1. What experience from your past is relevant today?
Oh, interesting. Well, because we are having this conversation, I think my experience from my time at Microsoft is going to be part of the conversation. So that's relevant for today and this time together.
I love that. Dr. McKenna.
I'll go number 9.
All right, number 9. I don't even have to count. You guys are making this too easy. What is the unique contribution you bring to every team?
Strategic foresight. I like to think down the road about things that are coming. Is something I bring that is unique. I also am an integrator, so I like to connect the dots between different parts of the story of our organization and our business and our impact and our movement. So that's what comes to mind right now.
Awesome. Thank you for going there. Chris, that card I pulled for you was so perfect because we wanted to start off by talking about the fact that you spent 3.5 decades at Microsoft. What have you learned since being a part of the WiLD Leaders leadership team and doing this work that you wish you had known back then?
Yeah, such a great question. And there are many things, right? Like there's so many things that I wish I had known when I was younger and sort of discovering my passion about people and leaders and culture. But 3 things specifically kind of jump to my mind. The first one is tools. I was doing work and leaning into leadership, sort of learning as I went, sort of pulling myself up on my bootstraps and grabbing truth from here and there. But having like a toolkit, a set of very specific developmental tools that were designed to focus on every aspect of building a whole leader. If I had those when I was working with leaders at Microsoft, that would have been really, really helpful. So that's number 1. The notion of learning together. I had a sense that that was important, and I sort of tried to do that as I worked with leaders and their teams. But really, since I've been working with WiLD, seeing that it's absolutely critical that leaders building their skills together vulnerably is what is going to build trust. I wish I'd known that because I would have leaned into encouraging leaders to do the work together more. And then finally, the big word, the T word, the third T word in my trifecta, trust. Of course, I think we all understand inherently that trust is important, but the foundational nature of trust and how important that was, and some of the dynamics of we have a trust quadrant, and one of the trust quadrants is islands of trust, which is where your trust within your team is high, but in the organization or other teams. And we never measured trust at Microsoft, but if we had, I am sure that it would fall squarely in the islands because of the stack ranking and the distrust between people that was fostered at the company. And if I'd understood that, to be able to address that distrust across organizations that was so prevalent. Guns pointed at each other is sort of the cartoon that characterized Microsoft back in the day. If I had known that, I could have more intentionally leaned into helping build trust and address it directly between organizations and people on different teams.
coming from you, especially with all that experience there, and me having some exposure from the outside to Microsoft, and that growth in you is such a testimony to like of what it means to continue to grow as a senior leader is awesome. The other thing, Chris, that when you celebrated your 1 year anniversary with WiLD, having a chance to just think about some of the contributions you've made to us. Because when you bring in a new leader to your team and your organization, you want to know as much as you can about what you're getting. You know what I mean? Both of us, right? You wanted to know, and we wanted to understand that. And then the reality is that there's so much space to grow into, that has been just, you've had such a catalytic, I don't even have a better word, just impact on our team, and our leadership team. And I just am so grateful for that. So let me go with a big question to get this conversation going around trust specifically is why is it important, Chris, as someone who has experienced and watched people assessing trust now, why is it important to measure trust?
There's many reasons why I think it's important because it's so critical to the functioning of everything that we do. But when I think about measuring it, you're really taking something that is unknown and making it known. And I think of the model that I really enjoy because I think it's so applicable of sort of the 4 stages of unconscious incompetent. You're just in the dark and you don't know what you don't know. And then you move to conscious incompetence, which is what measuring does. And so I think it's important to measure because if you don't know, you can't do anything about it because
Mm-hmm.
there's no awareness. And so the big thought for me on why it's important to measure it is that you've taken something out of the dark, you've brought it into the light, and now you at least have the opportunity to leverage the strengths and focus on areas of opportunity so that you can move down the model, which if you're familiar with it, right, the next is conscious competence. You have to think about it, but you start bringing some competency in on that area that was previously unknown. And then finally, you move to unconscious competence, where you just do it well without thinking about it. But that's the model that came to my mind when I thought, when I think about the question, why is it important to measure it? Because if you don't measure it, you can't do anything about it.
Mm-hmm. Will you speak to the issue of scale? I think sometimes even senior leaders who are experiencing challenges of scale don't really give language to what it is that they're feeling and responsible for. And when it comes to measurement, you work with so many senior leaders. I'm curious about your perspective on the way a senior leader, and when I say senior leader, it may be someone who owns a, small to mid cap business, but now they're responsible for an entire organization as opposed to just relationships in a team. Why is it important for a senior leader to measure trust at scale? Maybe describe what scale means for people that may not know what we're talking about.
When you talk about scale and the importance to measure it at scale, the larger an organization gets, the more complicated it gets. And
Hmm.
there's various pieces to it. And in that complexity, it's hard to see or understand what's going on.
Hmm.
And so by measuring it at scale, you are painting a picture for the
Hmm.
leader that's bringing clarity to what otherwise would just be a big mass of complexity of people and systems and interactions that's going on. And when you deal with a large enough organization, you can take you can take a single picture of the whole thing at scale and say, here's what the whole thing looks like. But then we can also break it down into different parts, different divisions, different departments or locations or roles, and then start to paint a picture at a more detailed level of what do things look like, across these different segments, if you will. And
Hmm.
sometimes there's consistency, like it's the same across, and that's really helpful to know that there's a sort of a unified single opportunity or area of strength across the organization. And then there might be areas where an opportunity exists that doesn't exist somewhere else. One of the ways I love to leverage that kind of information when you're looking at this big scale issue is if you have parts of your organization that are doing really well on a particular item that another part of your organization is struggling with, well, you have strength, you have expertise, you have, people who in your own organization who you can tap to say, hey, what have you learned? What's working for you? How can we share that across the organization so you can leverage your own strengths between one area and another? So those are a couple of my thoughts when I think about, measuring this at scale and what you might do with it for the leader.
Yeah, and I so appreciate that because many people who have never functioned in a senior leadership role have not experienced the challenges of scale, of being responsible for large groups of people where you can't even know everyone's name sometimes, and so and when you get to that level and that you're responsible for those human beings, and so you have to have systems and measurement, some kind of data, so you're like as you would say, so you're not walking in the dark, so that you have something to make decisions based on that, and then of course working hard at not losing sight of the individuals, but you're responsible for scale. And so I so appreciate that. So appreciate that.
Yeah, that's good. It reminds me of we've heard from previous podcast guests and had conversations about as that measurement from the top down across, it begins a conversation. Chris, you've sat with a lot of leaders as they discover where they land in our WiLD trust quadrant. What is the most common emotional response you see? And what do you think that tells us about trust in leadership today?
Well, this one's actually really easy because it is pronounced and it is pretty universal. And that emotional response is gratitude. Gratitude when they score high and gratitude when they score low. The gratitude when they score high is really coming from a place of, thankfulness. And even there have been a couple of leaders who've been brought to tears because most leaders want to do well. They pour themselves into their organizations and they hope that their efforts to care for people and create an environment where they can thrive is making a difference, but they don't have any measurement of that. And to hear from their people that they are creating an environment and things are going so well, they are so grateful. There's so much gratitude that they've been brought to tears. And then, of course, others not quite brought to tears, but still very, very thankful that things are going well. And in some of the lowest, and I'm talking about really low scores, there was also just this huge amount of gratitude that they had the information that was actionable, that people told the truth. So they were grateful to have an accurate measurement. People weren't pulling punches, right? They weren't holding back. And they were just very grateful for the clarity and the actionability that the results gave them. If employees could actually be in the meeting with me and see their leaders' results, their level of trust in their leadership would go way up. And I do think that as the leaders share with the organizations, a lot of that comes out. And just in the act of doing that, wherever the level of trust was, low or high, it increases as they start their journey on taking those insights and doing something with it.
That is so interesting, Chris. Sabeth and I talked about some of the questions we wanted to ask you. And I don't know, Sabeth, you thought that's what he would say.
That's not the emotional response that I was expecting, but it makes sense. It says a lot about the leaders who are responding to these results.
Kind of related to that is from all these conversations you've had, and you are the person at WiLD Leaders who has been closest to the senior leader responses. You've seen it over and over and over again. What have you learned about the strategic blind spots? And I'm not slamming those leaders for saying blind spots, but the strategic blind spots that they become aware of when they see their WiLD Trust Index results. They may be in any of the four quadrants and maybe not know it, or in some cases go like, yeah, this makes complete sense. What have you seen that they become aware of, or when it comes to those blind spots?
I would generally categorize leaders into two buckets. They fall into either they know they have an issue with trust, so this is kind of their current awareness, or they're unsure. So those are kind of the two buckets. And both of them, if they know they have a trust issue, their blind spot is they don't know the details. It's just a very general purpose. Yeah, we got issues with trust, but I don't even know how to think about trust. And as you talk about, it's like air. I try to grab it and it's not tangible. And the survey and the results from the trust index give them precise actionable areas of opportunity, and they get a framework within which to think about trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels, and then within each one of those. So it's like, yeah, I knew I had an issue with trust, but it really is manifesting here in this team space, and not just in team generally, but in these three specific, aspects and drivers of trust within teams. So their blind spot gets illuminated because they know they have an issue with trust, but they don't know how. For the unsure person, their blind spot is, I'm just not sure. They certainly hope that it's high. I don't know what it is, and now you've told me what it is. And for some, they hope it's high, and it is high. And that's great. They're very grateful for that. But even then, I haven't seen a single leader, even in the absolute highest, and we've had some very, very high scoring, high trust organizations. Even in those cases, and in all cases, no matter where they are, the leader is, where can I improve? How can I move further up and further to the right on our quadrant, increasing both team trust and organization trust? Their blind spot is, I don't know where I'm at. Now I know where I am at. And just like the person who knew they had a trust issue, but not sure exactly where, that same illumination happens for the leader who was unsure, because now they understand where they are and how they can improve as far as their opportunity areas and strength areas to leverage.
Isn't the reality that we all have blind spots? We just can't. It's like in the car, I taught my sons when they learn to drive, check your blind spot. Check that space where the mirrors don't show who's there. And if you don't check it, you don't know they're there. And we've gotten lazy now because we've got these lane indicator lights,
Yeah.
right? But I don't even trust that. Like I can't rely on the technology perfectly. I also wanted to ask you about, because you kind of talked about this a little bit, but you have had conversations with several organizations and senior leaders who score quite low. And I'm curious about what those responses would be like, because I think a lot of people who might be considering measuring trust might be thinking, I'm kind of afraid to do this because what if I land in the jungle? And I'm just curious about some of those responses in those feedback moments.
Well, the jungle, as you know, is where both team and organizational trust are low. It's a place where, because of that, it's dark, it's unsafe, it's hard to navigate, as sort of the label we've put on it, jungle, gives it. And again, going from unconscious incompetence to conscious incompetence, it's those leaders. We had a leader who had just taken over for a CEO who had been fired for doing a terrible job, and the organization was in shambles. And this new leader knew that trust was going to be low and wanted to measure it anyway, so that they had a baseline. Again, in general, I might know or understand that trust is low, but that I can't do anything with that. But if I know that on these three areas at the organizational level, that's where my biggest opportunities lie within trust, then I can go after those particular things. I can focus on them. I can be intentional, as opposed to just, well, let's all try to be more trustworthy and hope it works out. Let's just talk about it more, and maybe that'll help. Talking about it doesn't actually build trust. There are specific actions you need to take, and responsibility you need to take on yourself to say, here's what I can do as a leader, as the leader, and what can the people who report to me do? And as everybody starts to take responsibility for how they're showing up, how they are trustworthy and they trust themselves, again, that's the foundation, then the trust at the team and organizational level start to grow.
You're highlighting something else in our statement about you can measure trust and you can build trust. Now you can measure it, now you can build it. And so often we approach something like an assessment like the WiLD Trust Index as a test. So you either failed it or you passed it. And so if an organization, and you're highlighting my next question too about, but if an organization lands in the jungle with low team and low organizational trust, it's not just about measuring it. It's about building it at the very same time. So once they have those levers and they identify the specific thing they could do beyond like just talking about trust, like what could I actually do that would build it? And so these leaders, what I'm hearing you say is like they have a growth mindset, right? They have an approach that says, I'm not just going to assess this like I took the test and I failed and now I'm done, but I took the test and now I've got to learn. right? I've assessed, and now where can I go? I'm kind of curious about what has surprised you most about the kinds of leaders who engage deeply with their trust data. And maybe what has that taught you about what makes someone editable? That word we use, editable, that willingness to change, and as I described, have the backspace key, hit on things that even might feel like they're a part of our character. So what have you learned about all that, about the kinds of leaders?
Yeah, well, as I think about all the different types of organizations that we've worked with, and they really have been all different industries, all different types of organizations, shapes and sizes of organizations, the type of work that they do. The leaders have spanned the spectrum of personality types. And, we had very strong type A leaders. We've had, very, very caring and, people oriented, emotional leaders, and everything in between. And so across all of that, everybody that we've worked with, change is hard for all of them, right?
Mm,
And what we're talking about here is fundamentally change, changing the way that you think and the way that you act. And so I don't think editability is inherent in a certain type of leader or a certain type of organization that they run or whatever. It's a choice,
mm,
right? It has to be. And and the good news is anyone can make that choice to be editable.
mm,
So it's simple. It's not easy because
mm,
change is hard. Editing is hard. But the choice is pretty simple. It's just to decide to do it. And here's the thing. If you decide to, I'm going to be editable, I'm going to try and change, and then you fail, right? Out of the gate, you probably will. What does that mean? Well, it means that you're on the journey already. And if you say, okay, I'm not going to, if you just stop there, okay, that's no, you have a choice to keep in it and keep at it and looking at that failure and going, what can I learn from that? And do it a little differently next time.
mm,
So I don't know that it surprised me. It's just really more an observation and an encouragement that so many leaders across, no matter what they're doing or what they're like, can be editable. And of course, every one of them is at a different point in their journey of being editable, right? Their editability, if that's a word.
mm-hmm,
Um, but their willingness, and even just the fact that they want to measure, that they've made the choice to be vulnerable and open up their organization to us to dig in and look at trust. That's a very courageous thing to do as a leader. And the fact that they're willing to do that is a first step towards that. And then we take it from there.
mm,
And how are leaders using these results not just to reflect on the moment they're in, but taking action for what's next? And maybe even let's talk about different contexts where trust should be measured or not.
Mm. Well, let me start with that last part, because if you say, is there ever a context in which, or an organization where you shouldn't measure trust? My first response to that is no, absolutely not. However, let me caveat that. If a leader of an organization is going to measure it and then do absolutely nothing with the results, they're not going to share the results with anybody. They just, because for whatever reason, I would say that's a scenario. If we get the sense that that's where a leader's at, then I would say we should not measure trust there. Because if you ask your employees what they think and they take the time to share with you their perspective and then you do nothing with it, that's going to have worse results than if you just never bothered to ask them in the first place. So I would say that would be the one example. But in every other case, the absolute minimum thing you can do is do just that. Share the results with people,
mm,
because that in and of itself is an action. It's an acknowledgement, because there are measures in there that are a reflection of you as the leader and your leadership team. So you're demonstrating vulnerability, which is one of the key aspects of trust, just by sharing the results with your organization. Here's how we did. Here's our areas of strength. And again, even the lowest scoring organizations have areas of strength. And here's our area of opportunity. Now, there's lots more that can and should be done from there, but even that simple act is the first thing that we encourage everybody to do. The other thing that we've seen organizations do, and they've even asked for our help in doing this, is how do we engage in a conversation to start ideating and discussing and digging into some of the nuances of where we've scored. What's the story behind some of those things? And so we've put a workshop together. And so with several organizations, we've sat down and not just looked at the results, but talked about the results, starting to ideate on what's the story behind those results. What could we do? And that then sets up, actions that they commit to taking to start improving those things. And even without our encouragement, people have said we should have this conversation on a regular basis. We should build it into our rhythms of the conversations we're having and keep the conversation going as opposed to just being a one-time thing. And that, as we know, even just with developmentally, with leader development, that is a key to really lasting change. And so on the trust index results, that kind of approach is what we're seeing is being really effective.
And one of the things, Chris, you're highlighting for our listeners is that assessment itself is part of the intervention. And I think sometimes people would think, oh, you have the WiLD Trust Index. It assesses trust across my organizations, within myself and within individuals, within teams, and are the conditions there for trust to be built. And when people see their results, I want people to be clear about this. It's not a bunch of questions that simply say, do you trust me? Do we trust each other? It's the drivers of trust that are not actually, most of the questions asked do not include the word trust. And so when you share those results, because it's a part of the intervention, the actual change process, because people are answering questions like, am I reliable? Are my team members consistent and reliable? Do we tell each other the truth? Are we doing our jobs well? Do I feel competent? And so these are the specific kinds of things, the drivers that we assess. And when you share those results, it's like when you buy, I don't know why I use Volkswagens all the time, but if you buy a Volkswagen, what do you see all over the road? You see Volkswagens, and it just happens all the time. And so when you've given people a pathway to say like, oh, there's a question I need to think about. Am I a reliable member of my team? And so that's why it begin. Now we would say that's not enough. We hope you would do more, but that even that assessment and sharing those results is a part of that intervention. That intervention meaning that we're trying to change something. And so measurement itself begins.
Absolutely. That's your reticulated activator, I think is what they call that in your
Yeah.
brain, that, brings those things to mind as after it's been put in there, right? You stuck it in your brain. And so the act of answering the question, your brain starts spinning. And then we hear the results for that same question and it reminds us again, and our brain continues to spin on that topic. And now, again, a lot of it is coming from that. I didn't even know to think about that. And now I'm aware that this is an important issue. And when I see it in myself or I see it happening with other people, I'm much more likely to go, oh, that is a reliability thing, or that is a telling the truth thing, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
And now I can at least make a choice to do something different. But at a minimum, I've noticed that, you know what, that wasn't the way it should be. And I wouldn't have noticed that before if we hadn't asked the question, if I hadn't answered it. And so that awareness, raising that awareness in the system, now all of a sudden empowers the people in the system to do something different because they can't claim ignorance anymore
Right.
because they've been made
That's
aware.
huge.
And so one of the things you're making me think also is that we are not therapists, by the way. I'm not a clinical psychologist. That is not our expertise. However, it made me think about it. We've been watching a show about therapy, couples in therapy together, and how so much of and I know enough about different therapeutic approaches, to that whole process to be a little dangerous. But it's like when a couple comes in and the therapist is just trying to figure out the entire invisible landscape of a relationship. And in many ways, if you imagine putting your organization into a therapeutic moment instead of a consultant trying to have to figure out everything from scratch, like what's all the nuance going on in terms of interpersonal relationships and the conditions and the culture and the organization that are driving all of this. If you at least had a starting scaffolding for what are the key things that are occurring, then we can get into the conversation, get to the story behind the numbers that we talk about all the time. Can I wanted to get into a couple of some of the specific contexts where we're measuring trust, or where people might be saying like, how does this relate to my story and my context? And one of the places that we see often is organizations where the power is less centralized, and I'm not over pivoting to power as specifically, but where centralization of operations, of structure, of what's required is less centralized. And we actually see this, right, Chris, more commonly than I actually ever expected, where senior leadership is like, well, we don't want to, demand that people go through this or that or experience certain kinds of things. And so they struggle and they hesitate to sort of have a stronger sort of sense of conviction about what needs to happen because they have more kind of decentralized power out into different regions of the world or of their organization. This is a big question. So, in that kind of a context, Chris, why would it be important to assess trust in organizations without that kind of centralization? And what have been some of your experiences of seeing that?
You are poking at my passion for systems theory and looking
Uh,
at systems kind of broadly. And so, yes, it's true that how leaders show up matters.
hmm,
It matters a ton, and the amount of how much um, the leadership of an organization is influencing everything else, of course, matters for sure. Um, so that's always going to matter. But even in those scenarios, I would say that to change culture broadly at scale, back to that concept of scale, it requires every individual because culture, we could dig into the definitions of cultures and a lot of different ways to think about it, but one of them is essentially just how people show up is the culture, right? And so every person in the organization has a responsibility and has the power, if you will, in themselves to show up differently, to contribute to that overall culture and system that's happening. And so I would say, independent of whether you have more or less influence, power, whatever you want to call it, at the top, or if it's more distributed, that trust and all of those relationships and interactions that are happening kind of at the ground level, at every level, between individuals, between organizations or departments, or up and down, managers to direct reports, and there's you can slice it a bunch of different ways. All of that is going to need to participate in building trust and maintaining trust over time. And so
hmm,
I would say that, while there might be some nuances in how you might approach that with one organization or another, as you're thinking about working on trust within that organization, for the most part, because so much of it does require everybody's participation, that it doesn't matter, that context doesn't matter as much as you might think it would.
Building trust in your business starts with being able to measure it so that you can create a pathway for change. Our WiLD Trust Index measures the drivers of trust at the personal, team, and organizational levels. We are building the largest database on the drivers of trust inside of organizations. This survey will inform growth imperatives and the necessary organizational change needed to fuel that growth. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the WiLD Trust platform, and get started with the WiLD Trust Index today.
Will you speak to something else you alluded to? Because we do something called segmentation. And for organizations that are interested in what that is, will you explain that, what segmentation is about and how we do that?
In a larger organization, we would measure trust and you would get one set of numbers for the whole thing. And that's, of course, an average. And when an organization is large enough, they might be interested in saying, hey, I'd love to understand whether trust in this geographic location is different than that one, or within this department, or between these roles. And so we will segment, we will look at those numbers for each of those segments and see, is there any differences between them? And if there are, then you can decide whether approaching those or addressing those differently with one department or another makes sense. Or, like I said earlier, if you're leveraging, if you have a department that's doing really, really well, you could leverage those strengths to help other departments across the organization.
Chris, another context that we hear often about is moments where there's a transition in leadership, where it might be a moment where we're coming up on a transition. We deal with a lot of small to mid cap businesses where there's a family-owned business or a founder who is considering, assessing trust before evaluation. You might be in an organization where I met with one yesterday where it's a university with a fairly new president, and they're in this moment where that transition has already occurred. Some organizations where that the succession process is now beginning to think about what does succession look like. In some cases, we might even experience ones where there's no CEO in the middle. um, like, how would you think about the importance of measuring trust in those moments of leadership transition?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we've had a number of organizations who have been in the middle or had just gone through that. And as we have conversations with them, one of the common responses is, oh, hey, because things are so disrupted right now, it would not be a good time to measure trust. We need time, to build it or to settle things down, and then maybe we'll measure it. And that's, of course, the leader's decision. But understanding where it's at out of the gate as a baseline, right? A new leader coming in might think, oh, I haven't had a chance to establish trust. But trust in them and the level of trust might actually be really high out of the gate, which would be great information to have as they think about how they're going to spend their precious time in the first 90 days of being, in that leadership position, whatever.
Mm.
And if it's not high, again, really helpful to know to gain insight, to create clarity around what am I dealing with? What's this foundation, this baseline of trust currently, so that we can then be intentional about where we want to, in the transition and in building the new thing, whatever kind of transition they're going through, they can focus again their precious time on the most important areas of trust, along with strategic and business related tasks and priorities that are, of course, going to be the case in those scenarios. So I think I don't think there's ever a bad time to measure trust. And maybe in those times of transition, it's maybe the most important time and the most helpful, the most leveraged time to be able to measure trust and have that insight as you move forward.
What are your thoughts on measuring trust in a larger organization or corporation in one area? So, for example, let's say you had a chief revenue officers in charge of all sales and revenue for an organization. What are your thoughts on that senior leader saying, I know that my rest of my organization isn't doing this yet, but I'm going to measure trust in my part of the organization. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I love that question, and we've done that. And what's happened is, so it's been great because that particular leader in that organization is empowered, they're energized, they're excited, and often some of the issues when you measure organizational trust is not just for that department, but they're actually pointing to other issues and interactions between other departments. And so it starts to shed light on maybe some opportunities in other parts of that company or organization. And we had one just recently, just a week or two ago, who the leader shared his results with his peers to say, hey, here's what we're doing in our organization. And the peers were like, wow, that's really interesting. And now we're starting some conversations about maybe it might make sense to measure trust across a larger swath of the organization.
Oh,
So it could
oh.
be a great way to, lead by example and bring something into an organization at a smaller level that then spreads across the organization once they see the value of those insights.
You are lighting my brain up because we have done this work in so many different contexts. What about on a board? And so a lot of organizations, there's a lot of talk still been going on for a couple of decades now about board governance and now trust in boards. And I know there's a lot of ways to picture what this looks like. What are your thoughts on measuring trust within the context of a board of directors?
Well, I have had the privilege of serving on several boards of directors. Um, and my wife currently serves on the board of our HOA of our little 13 home neighborhood. So I have a bit of insight into boards at many different levels. And, I would say as an entity that is responsible for stewarding an organization that they are over and connected to, that the level of trust to the extent that it impacts their effectiveness, which we know it absolutely does, is a critical group of people to measure trust within themselves. Um, and, I guess at the best you have boards that are adding a ton of value, strategic value to an organization. Maybe the most common is that they're kind of neutral. They're not really adding much value or not. They're not getting in the way. And then, of course, you've got examples, and we've seen them, where the boards are dysfunctional, they're getting in the way, they're dragging an organization down. And what a travesty, because the organization can try to build trust and operate well despite that at the top leadership, the board as the top leadership of an organization. Yeah, I think it's critical to measure it there. Really, if you want to just break it down, any group of people that want to interact together and accomplish something, whether that's a family, a marriage, a neighborhood, an organization, a board, trust is so universally foundational to our existence.
One of the other places, Chris, where we have conversations off is organizations that have assessed different things. They have maybe they have used different kinds of personal development assessments as one example. But in this case, I'm thinking about culture specifically, and where people have been very interested in they've already done some sort of a culture assessment, or as some organizations call a pulse survey, or some kind of a snapshot of where they are. And we get asked this sometimes, is that relationship between culture and trust, and how to think about the WiLD Trust Index within the context of a culture assessment. What are your thoughts on that and your experiences with that?
Yeah, you're right. It's a pretty common question that organizations say, "Hey, we already do an employee engagement or culture survey. Why should we do the trust index?" Or the other way the question is asked is, should we just replace our culture survey with the trust index survey? And the way we respond to that is that, and how to think about them they're complementary.
Mm,
And the way I describe it is, we believe that because trust is so foundational to everything else, that the trust index is really measuring that foundation. If you think of Patrick Lencioni's, Five Dysfunctions of a Team, he has trust as that foundational layer of the triangle that everything else is built on. So we measure it, and that's kind of the ground on which you're building your culture that everything else shows up about. And so
mm,
while some culture surveys might ask one or two questions about just generally how trust is going, it's not going to give you the kind of precision for that foundation. So I wouldn't throw out an entire culture survey just because there's a couple questions that might be slightly related. Most of the culture questions are measuring other things. And I would say all of those things are an expression of or are influenced by the level of trust at that foundation. If trust
mm,
is high, culture is going to be more healthy. If trust is low, you're going to have some culture issues. So if you just did the culture survey, you might say, wow, we've got these culture issues, but that's a symptom typically. What's the
mhm,
root cause? Well, we believe that the root cause is going to be at that foundational level of trust.
mm,
And so they're very complementary and they work together. Our survey takes about 5 to 10 minutes for any individual to take. So it's not a heavy lift. It's not a lot of work to say, oh, survey fatigue, that's a real thing. But if your culture and engagement surveys take, half an hour, 90 minutes for an employee to take, that's a lot of burden. Yes, we're not adding a lot of burden on to that.
mm.
And so it's pretty lightweight for the impact and the value and the weight of the insights that we're giving you. So that's the kind of conversation I'll have with a leader who's curious about how these two things interact and how to think about the two of them. I think both are important.
One last context, Chris, I wanted to ask about is the context of a church. There's a lot of interesting organizational opportunities and challenges within a church context. Churches are organizations and have operational challenges, they have financial challenges, then they have human challenges, because they are led by human beings. And Chris, I'm just curious about your thoughts on measuring and assessing trust within a church or maybe some more general ministry, parachurch kind of context?
So often, leaders of those organizations, whether it's a pastor or an executive leader, a faith-based organization, they often don't get the kind of business training in the fundamentals of running an organization. And so if you take that and extend it to, then how does that flow into how the organization runs and what do they focus on and their systems? It's more organic, it's less formal, more chaotic often, I think. And in those environments, now if you bring it back to trust, it's just another piece of what can break down. And having that scaffolding, that framework, think about trust. Maybe it's high, maybe it needs some work. And then again, build that as a foundation that everything else can build on top of would be incredibly valuable for an organization like that.
If you're listening right now and we're not addressing your context, send an email to contact@wildleaders.org and we'll do our best to address your context at some point, because you may have questions where you're like, how would it work in this space? And so please send us a note and we'll on a future podcast or certainly get you information on that as well.
Lots of rich conversations and stories to tell with all of those contexts. We released the State of Trust at Work report. What are 3 key findings that are important for leaders to know about trust?
Based on the report, yeah, and having helped put that thing together and doing all the data analysis for it, at the highest level, when you take a step back and you think about what we did there, and Rob said this earlier, so I'm just going to repeat it. I think one of the biggest key findings is, you know what? We set out to measure trust, and we did. We can measure trust. And because we can measure it, you can build it. At the most foundational level, that's one of the biggest key findings that the report is showing, and our work with organizations that feed into the report and our insights demonstrate. Key finding number 1, you can measure and build trust. The other one is one of the insights that really shocked us. And as different leaders see their own results, they are surprised by this. And really, I'll say every individual's experience is different. And that shows up in our results by the fact that 43% of individuals live in the jungle, have a lived experience of being in the jungle. That's low team trust and low organizational trust, not a place that's pleasant to be in, when their organization actually overall scored in the stronghold. So the org results overall, really pretty good. And yet almost half of the employees within that organization, their lived experience is not that. It's less than that. And that just highlights a principle that is part of our DNA, which is focusing on the one with an eye to the many. Meaning, if the focus on the many, the overall results of the organization looks pretty good, don't lose sight of the fact that that's not everybody's experience. Every individual's experience is different. And our data shows, and we show each organization how many of their people are living in the jungle when they score in the stronghold, that you want to focus on. And the opportunity is to think about every individual's experience as you work on and improve everybody's experience, and you have less and less people living in the jungle. Of course, your overall results, the many results, will go up. So that would be sort of my second key takeaway. And then if you look at the report, and I've mentioned this in a number of different ways as far as the precision with which we give insights into where you might be strong with trust or having an opportunity. The key drivers, and so the report outlines in each of the areas at the personal, team, and organizational levels, what are the key drivers, the areas that if you focus on those are going to move the needle more than others, independent of whether you scored lower or higher on them. And so I think the finding statistically through the data of what the key drivers are helps organizations focus on the levers that are going to move trust the fastest and have the biggest impact. And I think that's just incredibly empowering when you're looking at your results thinking, now what do I do? So those would be the 3 things I would highlight as I think about it, the key findings from the report.
This has been a conversation full of insights and wisdom and experience. And there's so much more to talk about. Chris, thank you for your time together with us today. How can the people listening connect with you? Yes, with the work that you're doing with us here at WiLD, but also in general, what is the best place for our listeners or those that are watching to find and connect with you?
Yeah, best place is hook up with me on LinkedIn. So just look for Chris Shaffer on LinkedIn. If I'm
Perfect.
associated with WiLD, that's me.
One last wild question. Are you in a season of accepting yourself or changing yourself?
I think that I am learning so much in the work that I'm doing here with WiLD, and there's so much more to learn and editing myself. So I'm just going to go with change, a season of changing, which I think is going to be a long season, which is great.
Thank you for listening to this WiLD Conversation podcast. For more information, visit wildleaders.org, click on the WiLD Trust platform, and get started with the WiLD Trust Index today.